In this demo, we're going to cover the binding mode property and how it influences the direction of flow of data through a binding. Starting point for this demo is a simple little data app that has a data entry form for a customer object here. And it has this button to trigger a customer change. If you watch the name field, when I click on that, it's going to go programmatically set the name of the customer. Now, the current structure of the code is we're setting the data context to the window itself through a relative source binding like we saw earlier in this module. We've got the grid as a whole bound to a customer property exposed from the Windows code behind. And then the individual fields are just using data context bindings to point to the properties of that customer object. Now, by default, a binding has a mode, and the default mode depends on the property that you're binding on the control itself. Data entry controls, such as text boxes, combo boxes, date pickers, and so on, set the default mode for their primary edit properties to be a two-way binding. That means that if I run here and we edit the field and tab out of it, we can see from this breakpoint that the set block on our name property on the customer object is being called. So the normal flow is from the source object to the element with the binding, but if we edit it in the bound element, then that property is going to change and push the value down into the source object in a two-way data binding fashion. And as long as that object supports property change notifications, if it gets changed programmatically, like with our button, it will update on the screen. That's your typical two-way data binding scenario. Now, we could modify the behavior here by going into our binding and setting the mode property equal to one of the other values. I'll start with one way. If we explicitly set it to be a one-way binding, and we have that same breakpoint on our customer object behind the scenes, I can modify that name property and tab out of the field, but we never hit our breakpoint because it never pushed that value down into the source object because it's set to be a one-way binding. One-way means from source to target, not the other way around. Now, if we did want it to be the other way around for some reason, we could set the mode to one-way to source. If we do one-way to source and start up, we can see that our form starts up and the field is blank. Even though there is a value in the underlying customer object for name, it didn't read it because it's only got the one direction in the opposite direction that a binding normally works. But if we change the value and tab out of the field, you can see that we call the set block on our bound object. Now, it's a pretty rarely used value. Generally, you want one-way or two-way, but that's an option if you have a specialized scenario. Another option you have there is one time. One time means that it will do normal data binding from source to target one time, but if it changes behind the scenes, even if it's raising change notifications, notice if I click on the triggered customer change here, under the covers we can see the property is being set, but the UI does not update. Because the mode of one time basically says do data binding one time and then pretend that this binding is not even there. And changes to the field itself will not trigger any change to the underlying source object. It's as if the binding evaporates after it does the initial read of the value from the source object.